Smoke drifted low across the beach, moving like a living thing in the cold Atlantic wind. The U-boat's conning tower broke the surface without a sound, steel dripping as it rose from the black water. A hatch slammed open. 4 men climbed out, their breath sharp, their boots striking metal before dropping into the surf. The youngest stumbled first. The sand was softer than he expected. His shovel slipped from his grip and vanished into the dark water. The shoreline was empty, or so they thought. Waves hissed behind them. Their rubber bags bumped against their legs, packed with explosives, fuses, and American clothes still smelling of factory dye. Each man felt the weight of the order in his chest, heavier than the crates they dragged through the breaking surf. Then a beam of light cut across the dunes. It froze them mid-step. A Coast Guardsman's silhouette appeared on the ridge, closer than any of them imagined possible. His flashlight swept once, twice, then stopped. It lingered on the strange shapes piled at the water's edge. One of the Germans breathed in too quickly. Salt scraped his throat. His hands shook, the smallest human crack in an operation, meant to feel flawless. The leader whispered a single command, and in that quiet, the question hung over the sand like fog. Would any of them leave this beach alive? The world beyond that moonlit beach had already shifted into a far more dangerous shape. By 1942, Germany was searching for new pressure points against the United States. The failed blitz over Britain had drained momentum. The Eastern Front was swallowing divisions by the week. And America, with its factories roaring and its shipyards multiplying, was beginning to tilt the industrial balance of the war. Berlin needed disruption, not battles. Damage, not armies. Sabotage offered a path where firepower had failed. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Operation Pastorius took form. Named after the first German settler in colonial America, it was meant to be symbolic. A return to a land Germany believed it still understood. The plan's goal was simple: strike the American mainland before it could fully awaken its war machine. Railroad choke points, aluminum plants, hydroelectric dams, canal locks, even department stores, all were marked as valid targets. The ambition bordered on reckless, but desperation had its own logic. To carry these men across the Atlantic, Germany relied on the same weapon haunting Allied convoys: the U-boat. Type 7s, compact and lethal, could glide toward the American coastline with unsettling ease in early 1942. The eastern seaboard was still poorly defended, its blackout rules inconsistent, its patrols stretched thin. From Berlin's perspective, the coastline invited intrusion. Yet success depended not on steel or machinery, but on 8 specific men. They were chosen less for loyalty than for familiarity with American streets. Some had lived in New York or Chicago before the war. Some spoke English with almost no detectable accent. The Reich believed this made them ideal operatives. It also planted the seeds for doubt long before they set foot on the U-boat. The 8 men selected for Operation Pastorius gathered at a remote training site near Brandenburg, where a small compound had been repurposed into a crash course in covert warfare. They learned to handle incendiaries, time pencils, industrial explosives, and disguised detonators. But the real emphasis was psychological. Instructors drilled them not in courage, but in deception. How to blend into American crowds, how to pass as workers, how to memorize alibis that could survive interrogation. Their faces were photographed, their stories rehearsed, their loyalties questioned again and again. Beneath the discipline, cracks formed early. George Dasch, the man appointed to lead the first team, carried those cracks more visibly than the others. He had lived in the United States for years, drifting between jobs, never fully settled. His German was fluent, but his sense of belonging was fractured. Some instructors suspected he was too familiar with America, too uncertain in his allegiance to the Reich. Yet he spoke confidently, passed every test, and won the role of leader under the assumption that familiarity equaled usefulness. The mission blueprint was cold and precise. 2 U-boats would deliver 2 groups, one to Long Island, the other to the Florida coast. Once ashore, they would bury their uniforms, switch into American clothing, separate into pairs, and disappear into the population. Their targets were spread across critical infrastructure: the Hell Gate Bridge in New York, the Horseshoe Curve Rail Line in Pennsylvania, the Niagara Power Facility, and factories feeding aluminum into bomber production. Time bombs were to be planted discreetly, with plausible deniability and no expectation of escape. Saboteurs were tools, not assets meant to return. It was this awareness that they were expendable that traveled with them as U-boat engines rumbled beneath their bunks. The crossing was long, the air dense with diesel and sweat. Every man carried a civilian past that did not quite align with the uniform he wore now. And when the hatch finally opened and the American coastline appeared as a dim line on the horizon, none could say whether they were stepping toward triumph or doom. Inside the U-boat, the mission felt less like strategy and more like confinement. Steel walls dripped with condensation. The air carried a permanent taste of oil and metal. Every bunk was narrow, every breath shared, every hour stripped of privacy. The saboteurs lived shoulder to shoulder with sailors who barely spoke to them, men focused on surviving depth charges, not escorting secret operatives to a distant shore. The tension was constant, silent, and heavy. At night, the saboteurs tried to sleep through the hum of engines and the groan of pressure on the hull. Dreams came short and sharp. One man pictured the Bronx streets he used to walk before the war. Another imagined the clatter of a Chicago train. These memories made the mission feel less like patriotism and more like betrayal. Yet no one spoke openly about the conflict inside them. Loyalty, at least the performance of it, was part of their survival. Dasch watched his team with a leader's stillness, but his thoughts ran in opposite directions. He knew the plan by heart, knew the targets, the schedules, the instructions to avoid radios and telephones. But he also knew what America looked like in winter light, how its crowds moved, how loud its freedom felt. He understood that once they stepped onto the sand, every man would be alone with his choices, and some choices would not align with Berlin's expectations. The closer they moved to American waters, the sharper the fear became. The U-boat ran silently near the surface, captain whispering orders, crew navigating through patches of moonlit waves. No depth charges, no patrol planes. The absence of danger made the danger feel closer. Every man rehearsed his cover story internally, repeating names, addresses, factory details, alibis. Slip once, and the FBI would not need evidence. Suspicion alone could end the mission. By the final night, none of them spoke. Every sound inside the submarine felt amplified. The clatter of a wrench, the soft cough of a sailor, the creak of metal shifting in cold water. They were nearing a coastline they once called familiar, yet now approached as enemies. And buried inside at least one of them was a decision that would redraw the mission in ways Berlin never anticipated. On the American side, the coastline felt deceptively calm. In 1942, the United States was still adjusting to the speed of war. Blackout rules along the eastern seaboard varied from town to town. Factories pumped out steel and aircraft parts through the night, their lights breaking into the sky. Fishing boats moved without radios. Beach patrols walked long, empty stretches with little expectation of intrusion. The ocean was a wide, open frontier, too big, many thought, for foreign footsteps to land unnoticed. But the FBI had begun to sense cracks forming in that assumption. Reports of suspicious vessels off the coast, hints of unusual U-boat movements, and fragments of intercepted communications suggested Berlin was looking west. Still, no one could predict how soon or how boldly Germany would attempt to insert agents. The sense of danger was abstract, distant. The front line was oceans away. On Long Island, the Coast Guard presence was thin. Patrolmen walked slow arcs along the dunes, watching for stranded fishermen, not saboteurs. The man who would stumble upon the German landing, John Cullen, was young, barely experienced, and unarmed. His flashlight was his only tool. The encounter he unwittingly approached was not part of any strategic briefing. It was a collision between routine and history. When Cullen saw shapes near the surf, he hesitated. The silhouettes didn't look like fishermen. They were too still, too organized. He moved closer, unsure whether he was witnessing a simple coastal violation or something larger. His instinct tightened. Something in the scene felt wrong. The way the figures shielded their faces from light. The way they stood in a cluster rather than scattering like startled locals. The saboteurs saw him approach. And in that moment, the operation's fragility became visible. A patrolman who should have passed by without incident had become the first unpredictable variable. One question now hovered over both sides of the sand. Who would speak first, and what would be said? The surf beat a slow, steady rhythm as the Germans dragged their crates higher onto the sand. Their uniforms were already buried beneath fresh dunes, shovels scraping softly, hands moving fast. Civilian clothes clung to them now, damp from the seawater. Every second felt borrowed. Every breath carried the weight of exposure. Then the beam of a flashlight drifted down the slope. John Cullen's boots pressed into the sand with hesitant steps. The glow of his light flickered across the wet shoreline, catching the edge of a rubber bag half buried in foam. The Germans froze. Dash stepped forward, raising a hand to shield his eyes, masking his face with deliberate calm. Behind him, one of his men tightened his grip on the shovel's handle. Cullen's voice wavered as he called out, asking what they were doing on the beach at night. The question hung in the cold air, sharp and uninvited. Dash answered quickly, spinning a story about being fishermen stranded in the dark. His English was smooth, practiced, almost convincing. But Cullen kept the light on him, noticing the unfamiliar clothes, the heavy boots, the strange bundles piled too neatly near the surf. The wind shifted. It carried the smell of fuel from the U-boat, faint but unmistakable. Cullen stepped closer. Dash reacted first. He walked directly toward the patrolman, closing the distance with a forced confidence, forcing Cullen to step back. His voice dropped low. He said they were locals. He said there was no trouble. And then he leaned in, pressing something into Cullen's hand. Money, folded tight, meant to end the conversation. For a moment, the only sound was the surf. Cullen didn't pocket the bills. He stared at them, at Dash, at the shifting tension behind him. He sensed danger, but couldn't map its shape. His breath quickened. He took a careful step back, then another. The Germans watched, unmoving, waiting for a signal, a mistake, any excuse to escalate. Cullen turned away in silence, retreating toward the dunes, his footprints marking a narrow escape that neither side fully understood yet. Behind him, the saboteurs stood in the dark, the mission shaken but still alive. For the moment. Cullen's figure vanished into the dunes, swallowed by darkness and distance, but the damage was already done. The moment he disappeared, the illusion of control collapsed. The saboteurs stood motionless, listening for alarms that didn't come, radios that didn't crackle, boots that didn't thunder toward the beach. Nothing happened. The coastline stayed silent, and that silence became its own kind of pressure. Dash exhaled sharply, then snapped orders. They buried the last traces of the landing, crates pushed deeper into sand, footprints brushed away, detonators rewrapped. Uniforms hidden beneath shifting dunes. But the rhythm of their work had changed. Every motion felt frantic, less rehearsed, more desperate. Cullen's retreat had left a question burning in all 8 minds. Had the patrolman believed anything? Or had he simply run to warn others? When dawn crept over the horizon, the team boarded a train to New York, splitting into pairs as planned. They blended into early commuters, their wet boots replaced by factory shoes, their accents softened with practiced restraint. Yet Dash carried something heavier than his assigned bag. The realization that the mission no longer made sense. The Reich had given them targets, funds, training, and instructions, but not a future. Their orders ended with destruction, not escape. And the first American they met had looked at them with suspicion strong enough to unravel the entire operation. Hours later, inside a Manhattan hotel room, Dash made the decision that would rewrite the mission. He picked up the telephone, the very instrument they were forbidden to touch, and asked to speak with the FBI. His voice was controlled, offering only fragments at first. Then more. Then too much to ignore. He confessed to being a German agent. He explained the landing. He described the bombs buried in the sand. And he asked to speak to J. Edgar Hoover himself. The FBI moved fast. Agents swept into stations, hotels, city blocks. They followed Dash's information with meticulous steps, finding his accomplices one by one. Shock rippled through every office touched by the investigation. German saboteurs on American soil, not a rumor, not a possibility, but a fact. Interrogations ran long into the night. Names surfaced, routes were traced. The Florida team was captured before they could detonate a single device. Within days, the entire operation lay exposed, its structure broken from the inside, not by American defenses, but by the voice of the man meant to lead it. Inside Hoover's headquarters, the atmosphere was electric. The public knew nothing yet, but analysts and agents understood the scale of what had been avoided. A single encounter on a dark beach, a bribe that didn't land cleanly, a leader who defected instead of obeying. These moments had altered the trajectory of sabotage on American soil. And as the final reports were typed, one chilling truth stood out above the rest. The Germans never expected their first words in America to be spoken in an interrogation room. The trials moved with a speed that reflected wartime urgency rather than courtroom tradition. Within weeks, the 8 captured saboteurs stood before a military tribunal convened under direct presidential authority. There were no public spectators, no press in the gallery. The rules of evidence were narrowed to essentials. The stakes were national, and the tone inside the chamber matched that gravity. The men entered wearing identical gray prison clothing, their hands clasped behind their backs, their faces drawn thin by sleepless nights and relentless questioning. The charges were clear: espionage, sabotage, and conspiracy to destroy American infrastructure during wartime. Each man listened as the summary of evidence was read aloud: the explosives recovered from the Long Island dunes, the sworn accounts of their training, the confession that unraveled the operation. The weight of the documentation was overwhelming. Dasch and Ernst Berger, who had also cooperated fully, sat apart from the others. Their testimonies had provided the backbone of the government's case, detailing targets, timelines, and the exact instructions given by German intelligence. The tribunal noted their cooperation, yet cooperation alone could not erase the severity of their mission. Their fate remained uncertain, suspended between punishment and clemency. President Roosevelt followed the proceedings closely. The United States had just entered a global war, its population anxious, its defenses still forming. A foreign sabotage team landing on American soil risked more than physical damage. It could shatter morale at a moment when unity was essential. Roosevelt's decision would become both legal judgment and wartime message. The tribunal continued without delay, guided by the pressure of national security and a mandate to move swiftly. Verdicts came faster than anyone expected. Guilty on all major charges. The sentences were staggering but unsurprising. 6 men condemned to death, 2 recommended for reduced punishment due to cooperation. The courtroom stayed silent as the decisions were announced. No outbursts, no final pleas. Only the hum of ceiling fans and the weight of consequences settling into the room. Outside the tribunal, the American public knew nothing. The case remained sealed under strict wartime secrecy. Newspapers carried no headlines. Radios broadcast no alerts. The arrests, the confessions, the tribunal, all unfolded behind closed doors. Even Hoover's office, often eager for publicity, stayed silent, choosing long-term security over immediate praise. In the hidden corridors of government buildings, the significance of what had been prevented spread quietly. The sabotage of rail lines, factories, and power stations could have crippled wartime production. Instead, the operation had collapsed before a single device detonated. The cost of failure now shifted to the men awaiting their sentences, held in a federal detention center under constant guard. In that silence, with death sentences looming and the world beyond unaware, the true aftermath began to take shape. A reckoning with choices made under pressure. Loyalties broken in the dark, and a mission destroyed by the very men sworn to complete it. Execution day arrived under a veil of secrecy. Before dawn, guards moved quietly through the detention center, unlocking heavy steel doors one by one. The 6 condemned men were led down a narrow hallway toward the chamber, prepared for them in the heart of the Washington, D.C. jail. No crowds gathered outside. No cameras waited. The United States carried out the sentences with the same silence that had surrounded the entire case. The men walked with uneven steps. Some stared straight ahead. Others cast brief looks at the floor, as if searching for something familiar to steady themselves. Their uniforms were plain. No insignias, no markers of rank. The war they had crossed an ocean to influence now felt impossibly distant, replaced by the stark reality of a mission that ended before it began. Witnesses observed the executions with restrained formality, noting times, procedures, the stillness that followed each drop. It was the largest espionage execution in American history, carried out swiftly, without ceremony. When the final curtain closed, the building remained quiet. The bodies were removed under guard. Records were sealed. The story stayed buried inside classified files. Dasch and Berger, spared by their cooperation, faced a different kind of sentence. They were transferred to federal facilities, held under strict conditions, their futures suspended between two nations. To Germany, they were traitors. To America, they were assets no longer needed. Their lives, once aimed at destruction, now drifted in a gray space between enemy and informant. Years later, both would be deported to Germany, returning not as operatives, but as men marked by the weight of a mission they had dismantled from within. In the broader war effort, Operation Pastorius became a turning point. American counterintelligence expanded rapidly. Coastal patrols tightened. The FBI developed structures to detect, intercept, and interrogate foreign operatives with far greater efficiency. The idea that enemy agents could slip onto U.S. shores undetected no longer felt theoretical. It had happened once, and the government vowed it would not happen again. Germany never attempted another large-scale infiltration by sea. The failure of Pastorius rippled through the Abwehr, exposing weaknesses in loyalty, planning, and psychological preparation. For a regime that demanded absolute obedience, the betrayal by its own chosen operatives was more damaging than the failed mission itself. The American public eventually learned fragments of the story, heavily filtered, shaped to protect wartime morale and national image. Newspapers reported the arrests and executions after the fact, presenting the operation as a swiftly resolved threat rather than the chaotic, fragile encounter it had truly been. What the public did not see were the moments of hesitation on the beach, the tremor in Cullen's voice, the deliberation in Dasch's mind as he lifted the telephone. And yet those small, human moments had shifted the arc of the operation more than any explosive device ever could. A patrolman's suspicion, a leader's crisis of loyalty, a confession that collapsed a plan years in the making. In the end, the aftermath of Operation Pastorius was measured not in destruction, but in prevention. Damage avoided, bridges left standing, factories undisturbed, power lines intact. The mission designed to cripple America instead strengthened it, prompting the creation of a counterintelligence architecture that would define the nation's wartime vigilance. Shadows had crossed the American shoreline, but they left behind a lesson carved into the quiet spaces of history. Even in war, the smallest decisions can redirect the course of nations. The night air along the eastern seaboard carried a quiet that belied the storm it had narrowly avoided. In the aftermath, history measured not only the lives lost or spared, but the choices made in fleeting, decisive moments. One man's hesitation, one patrolman's instinct, one confession whispered into a telephone. These ripples shaped the war on a scale far larger than any single act of sabotage could. Operation Pastorius left no monuments, no celebrated victories. Its legacy existed in silence, in the vigilance it inspired, in the unseen networks of counterintelligence that would guard a nation through its darkest hours. And yet, beneath the strategy and secrecy, the human element remained undeniable. Fear, doubt, loyalty, and betrayal all intertwined on a lonely stretch of sand, leaving an imprint far deeper than any explosion could have left. History often records the battles that roar, the cities that burn, the armies that clash. But sometimes, it is in the quiet, in the decisions made before a gun is fired, that the true measure of impact is revealed. on that moonlit beach, amid surf and shadow. The smallest human choices shape the course of a war, a reminder that in the vast machinery of conflict, the individual still holds power. The echoes of those footsteps, of those whispered words, linger far longer than the missions themselves.